The first map appeared on a Tuesday, not on paper, in the worlds. Elena Vasquez had drawn it 3 days before. A small island, crescent-shaped, floating in what she'd imagined as the middle of Lake Mendoza. She'd sketched it during lunch, absently, while eating a sandwich that had grown cold in the afternoon light of her studio. Just lines on paper, ink and imagination, a place that had never existed until it did. The call came from the park service at 7 in the morning, a ranger's voice, confused but certain. "Ma'am, there's an island in Lake Mendoza, about 2 acres, covered in silver birches. We've never seen it before, but it's on one of your maps." Elena held the phone like it might evaporate. Through her studio window, the morning mist hung low over the city she'd mapped 100 times. Streets she knew by heart, neighborhoods that had grown under her careful attention for 15 years. But she had never created one, never called something into being with nothing but paper and ink. She drove to the lake in her old blue Honda, the sketched map folded on the passenger seat like evidence of a crime she didn't remember committing. The island sat exactly where she had drawn it. Silver birches swayed in a wind that didn't touch the mainland. The water around its edges moved differently, slower, as if time itself had to adjust to accommodate something that shouldn't exist. A small dock extended into the shallows, weathered gray wood that looked decades old. She had drawn that dock, every plank, every nail, every shadow it cast on water that rippled with the weight of impossibility. Elena stood at the lake's edge for nearly an hour, watching the island breathe in the morning light. She didn't cross the water, not yet, not until she understood what she had become. That night, in her studio above the old bookshop, she laid out her tools like a surgeon preparing for an operation she'd never performed. Drafting table cleared, fresh paper, cream-colored, heavy, her grandfather's compass, brass worn smooth by decades of hands that had mapped the ordinary world. And then she began to draw. Deliberately this time, carefully. A place she had never seen but could feel taking shape beneath her fingertips. A valley, narrow and deep, carved between mountains that rose like cathedral spires into perpetual mist. At its heart, a river the color of pewter, flowing from a source hidden in the high country. Along its banks, a single stone bridge, ancient, built by no one for no one, except the idea of crossing. She worked until dawn, adding details that seemed to arrive without her choosing them. The exact angle of light that would fall across the bridge at noon. The species of moss that would cling to the northern faces of the stones. The sound the river would make as it passed beneath. Not quite a whisper, not quite a song. When she finished, she set down her pen and realized she was afraid, not of what she had drawn, but of what she was about to discover about the nature of reality itself. The call came 2 days later, this time from a hiker in the Cascade Range, 300 miles north. "I found your valley," he said, his voice distant through static. "The one with the stone bridge. It's not on any other map, but it's here, and it's exactly like you drew it." Elena drove north through forests that grew thicker as the road climbed into the mountains. She carried with her a canvas bag containing the original sketch of the valley, a notebook she had never written in, and her grandfather's compass, which had begun pointing northwest instead of north the moment she'd crossed the city limits. The hiker met her At the trailhead, a man named David, with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who spent his life touching wild places. "I've been hiking these mountains for 20 years, he said as they walked. "Valley wasn't here last month." The trail wound upward through old growth, fir, and patches of wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming in late October. But as they climbed, Elena began to feel something she had never experienced. The pull of a place she had created calling her home. The valley opened before them like a secret finally told. Everything was exactly as she had drawn it. The pewter river, catching light like scattered coins. The stone bridge, older than the mountains themselves, spanning water that had flowed here for exactly 3 days. But there was something more, something she hadn't drawn, but somehow expected. A figure standing on the bridge, tall, still, wearing a coat the color of autumn leaves. Even from a distance, Elena knew the figure was waiting for her. As they descended into the valley, David began to speak more softly, as if the place demanded reverence. "The animals here," he said. "They're not afraid. The deer walked right up to me. The ravens speak in languages I don't recognize. And the river," paused, listening to the water's voice. "The river knows things." They reached the bridge as the sun reached its highest point. The figure in the autumn coat turned to face them, and Elena saw her own face reflected back, but older, sadder, marked by years of carrying a weight she was only beginning to understand. "Hello, Elena," the other woman said. Her voice carried the sound of water over stones. "You're me," Elena whispered. "I'm who you become," the woman replied, "when you understand what you've been given and what it costs." The other Elena, who was to come, gestured to the valley around them. "Every place you draw takes something from the world to make room for itself. A forest disappears, a mountain erodes a little faster, a river changes course." She walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down at the flowing water. Creation requires destruction, even the gentlest kind. Elena felt the weight of every line she had ever drawn, every fictional street, every imagined building, every place that had never existed until she willed it into being. "How long have I been doing this?" she asked. "Since you were 7, the other woman replied. "The treehouse behind your grandmother's cottage. You drew it first. Remember?" Elena did remember. A child's sketch on the back of a grocery receipt. A simple treehouse in the old oak that had stood bare for decades. The next morning, her grandmother had called her outside to see the wooden platform that had somehow appeared among the branches overnight. "Magic," her grandmother had whispered, eyes bright with understanding. But magic always comes with rules. Standing now on the bridge in a valley that shouldn't exist, Elena began to understand the shape of those rules. "Why are you here?" she asked her future self. "To give you a choice," the woman replied. "You can continue as you are, drawing places into existence without understanding their purpose, or ... She reached into her coat and withdrew a rolled map tied with a silver cord. "You can learn to map what already exists but has been forgotten." Elena took the map with hands that trembled slightly. The paper felt ancient, warm to the touch, as if it had been waiting for her fingers for centuries. "What is it?" she asked. "The first map you'll draw that doesn't create something new," the other Elena said. It reveals something hidden. She pointed toward the far end of the valley, where the river disappeared into a grove of trees so thick with shadow that their trunks seemed to absorb light. There is a city beyond those trees, a place that existed once, but was lost to maps, lost to memory, lost to time itself. If you draw it, you won't be creating it. You'll be remembering it back into the world. Elena looked at the rolled map in her hands. And if I don't, then you continue creating islands and valleys and bridges that exist for no one and serve no purpose except to prove that you can. The wind moved through the silver birches that had somehow grown along the valley's rim, carrying the scent of places Elena had never been but was already beginning to miss. The choice is yours, her future self said, already beginning to fade, like morning mist touched by sun. But choose soon. The world has room for only so much magic before it begins to forget what was real to begin with. And then she was gone, leaving only the sound of water flowing over stones and the weight of possibility in Elena's hands. David had remained silent throughout the encounter, standing at the approach to the bridge like a witness to something he was meant to see but not understand. Now he stepped forward, expression thoughtful. She looked like you, he said simply. She was me, Elena replied, or who I might become. She unrolled the ancient map and spread it across the stone railing of the bridge. The paper showed not a place, but a process. Lines that moved, boundaries that shifted, contours that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of something vast and patient. At the center, written in script so old it seemed to predate language itself, were coordinates that led not to a location on Earth, but to a position in time. Elena understood. This wasn't a map of where something was. It was a map of when something had been. I need to go to the city, she told David. The one beyond the trees. He nodded, as if he had been expecting this. I'll wait here, he said. Someone should stay to make sure the bridge remembers which side is real. Elena walked across the stone bridge, her ink and intention had built, feeling the solidity of something that had never existed until she dreamed it into being. The river spoke to her in languages she was beginning to understand, the grammar of erosion, the syntax of flow, the vocabulary of patience worn smooth by time. At the far end of the bridge, the grove of shadow-thick trees waited like an open door to a room she had never entered, but had always been invited to explore. She stepped into the darkness between the trunks, following a path that appeared beneath her feet. With each step forward, the trees were older than old. Their bark was carved with symbols that seemed familiar, as if she had seen them before in the margins of maps she had drawn, but never finished. Gradually the shadows began to thin, and through the gaps between branches, Elena caught glimpses of something impossible. Architecture that defied geometry, spires that curved inward and still reached toward sky, streets that ran parallel to rivers, flowing upward, buildings that existed in more dimensions than her eye could process, but her heart could feel. The lost city. She emerged from the grove onto a hillside, overlooking the most beautiful place she'd never imagined. It was ancient and new simultaneously. Classical columns supported roofs made of crystallized starlight. Gardens grew in spirals that somehow returned to their beginning without ever turning back. But the city was empty. Not abandoned, empty in the way A concert hall is empty between the last note and the first silence, waiting. Elena sat on the hillside and opened her notebook for the first time. She began to draw, not to create but to remember. Each line she made wasn't an invention but a recognition. Each curve wasn't imagination but recollection of something she had always known but never seen. The city began to populate itself as she drew, not with people, with presence. Light moved differently through windows that had been dark moments before. Water flowed in fountains that had been dry stone. Wind carried music from instruments no one was playing. And in the central square, beneath a clock tower that kept time in colors instead of numbers, Elena saw them, all the cartographers who had come before her. Dozens of figures standing in patient silence, each holding maps of places that had never been, until someone loved them enough to draw them into existence. Her grandfather stood among them, holding the brass compass she now carried, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally passed on a gift he was never meant to keep. As Elena drew, she began to understand the true nature of her ability. She wasn't creating places, she was serving as a bridge between the world of possibility and the world of form. Every fictional place that had ever been imagined waited in a realm just beyond the edge of what most people could see. And some people, cartographers, storytellers, dreamers with steady hands, were given the ability to build roads between here and there. The city wasn't lost. It was waiting. All the cities, all the islands, all the valleys and bridges and secret paths that had ever been drawn by hands that understood the responsibility of creation. They were all waiting in a place that existed at the intersection of imagination and love. Elena finished her drawing as the sun set behind mountains that cast shadows and colors that had no names. The city was complete now, not finished, complete, full of the quiet life that flows through places that exist because someone believed they should. She stood and walked down the hillside toward the central square, where the other cartographers waited to welcome her home. As she approached, her grandfather stepped forward and placed the brass compass in her hands. Not the one she carried, but the original, the first one, the one that had started all of this centuries ago. "Your turn to keep the directions," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of stories told by firelight. Elena looked around at the faces of all the mapmakers who had come before her. "What happens now?" she asked. An elderly woman with ink-stained fingers and eyes the color of deep water smiled and gestured toward the fountain at the center of the square. "Now you learn to map the places that need to exist but don't know how to ask." Elena looked into the fountain's depths and saw not water, but the reflection of a world full of empty spaces, places where wonder had been forgotten, where magic had been explained away, where possibility had been traded for the comfort of certainty. "The world is forgetting how to dream," the woman continued. "Cities grow too fast, forests disappear too quickly, and people lose their way between what is and what could be. We map the paths back." Elena understood. Her purpose wasn't to create fantasy lands that served no one. It was to remember into existence the places that every human heart knows, but has lost the words to describe. The forest, where grief turns into acceptance. The mountain, where fear transforms into courage. The river, where loneliness becomes solitude. The bridge, where endings become beginnings. These places existed. They had always existed, but they needed cartographers to remember them back onto maps that people could follow when they forgot the way home to themselves. Elena spent the night in the city learning the craft of sacred geography from masters who had been practicing for lifetimes. She learned to read the landscape of the human heart. She learned to map the territory of healing. She learned to chart the coordinates of hope. And as dawn broke over spires that caught light like prayers, she knew it was time to return. But she would not return empty-handed. In her notebook now were the beginnings of maps for places the world desperately needed. Sanctuaries for those who had lost their way. Resting places for those who had forgotten how to stop. Gardens where broken things could grow whole again. Libraries where lost stories could find their voices. The walk back through the grove felt different this time. The trees whispered encouragement. The shadows offered guidance, and when she emerged onto the hillside above her created valley, she saw David waiting on the bridge, exactly as he had promised. But he was not alone. A small group of people had gathered at the bridge's center. Hikers, families, artists, people who had somehow heard about the impossible valley and come seeking something they couldn't name. They stood in quiet reverence, understanding intuitively that they were in the presence of something sacred. Elena walked across her bridge for what she knew would be the last time as its creator. From now on, she would visit it as its guardian. "Did you find what you were looking for, Gome?" David asked as she reached the center span. Elena looked around at the people who had been drawn to this place, not because it was famous or documented or recommended, but because their hearts had recognized the presence of wonder. "I found what I was given," she replied. That evening, back in her studio above the bookshop, Elena began the work that would occupy the rest of her life. One by one, she began to draw the maps that would guide people to the places their souls already knew existed. A map to the coffee shop at the end of sorrow, where the last cup of grief is always served with honey and the promise of morning. A map to the library of unfinished stories, where every abandoned dream waits patiently for someone to remember how it was supposed to end. A map to the garden of second chances, where the seeds of forgiveness grow into forests thick enough to get lost in, and beautiful enough to want to stay. Each map she completed would find its way into the hands of someone who needed to find exactly that place at exactly that moment. Some arrived in the mail with no return address. Others appeared tucked into library books exactly when the reader needed to discover them. Still others materialized on coffee shop bulletin boards or hospital waiting room tables just as the right eyes were ready to see them. Elena never knew how the maps traveled or who distributed them. She only knew that her job was to draw them with the same care her grandfather had used to chart the ordinary world, and with the same love that had brought the first impossible island into existence on a Tuesday morning when the world was ready for a little more magic. Years passed. The island in Lake Mendoza became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking solitude. The valley with the stone bridge became a destination for those learning to cross from who they had been to who they were becoming. And Elena continued to draw, her hair slowly turning silver, her hands growing weathered, but never unsteady. In her studio, surrounded by maps to places that existed just beyond the edge of the ordinary world, she felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned the difference between creating and remembering, between invention and revelation. On quiet evenings, when the light fell softly through her studio windows and the city below settled into its evening rhythm, Elena would sometimes take out the brass compass her grandfather had given her in the city beyond the grove. It no longer pointed north. It pointed toward need, toward the places on her ever-growing list that were waiting to be remembered into existence, toward the people who were searching for paths home to themselves, but didn't know such paths could be drawn. And Elena would smile, select a fresh sheet of paper, and begin the gentle work of creating doorways between the world that is and the world that could be, one careful line at a time. Outside her window, the ordinary city continued its ordinary business, unaware that just beyond the edges of every map, in the spaces between what is known and what is possible, a cartographer worked late into the night, drawing roads to everywhere that anyone had ever dreamed of going home. The last map she drew before falling asleep at her desk was the simplest, a single path winding gently upward toward a horizon that glowed with soft lights. At the bottom, in her careful script, she wrote, "For anyone who has ever been lost and needs to remember that all paths lead somewhere, and the most important destination is the moment you realize you were never lost at all, just traveling toward yourself by the most beautiful route." And in the morning, when the bookshop owner found the map slipped under her front door, she knew exactly who needed to find it, and exactly when they would walk through her door, looking for something they couldn't name, but would recognize the moment they saw it, because that's how magic works in a world where cartographers remember places into existence, quietly, gently, one perfect map at a time, until everyone who needs to find their way discovers that the path was always there, waiting for someone to draw it with love. The first message came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, when the fog was so thick it swallowed the beam before it could reach the water. Samuel Thorne had been keeper of Beacon Point Light for 11 years. He knew every sound the old tower made, the way the wind whistled through the lamp room, the creak of the iron stairs expanding in the salt air, the rhythmic pulse of the rotating lens casting its warning into the endless dark. But this sound was new. Tap, 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 long tap, short tap, long tap, Morse code, coming from the radio room where no radio had worked in over a decade. Samuel climbed the spiral stairs slowly, his footsteps echoing in the hollow cylinder of the lighthouse. Each step brought him closer to a sound that shouldn't exist. The radio room was exactly as he left it. Ancient equipment, covered in dust, wires disconnected. The Morse key sitting silent on the wooden desk, like a sleeping bird. But the tapping continued, not from the equipment, from the air itself, as if the very walls of the lighthouse were remembering how to speak. Samuel had studied Morse code in the Coast Guard 30 years ago. His fingers still remembered the rhythm, the language of dots and dashes that had once connected ships to shore, sailor to sailor, across the vast loneliness of the open sea. The message was simple, repeated 3 times, then silence. "Can you hear me?" He stood in the radio room for nearly an hour, waiting for more. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in, or trying to remember how to get out. Samuel made tea, Earl Grey, the way his wife Margaret had taught him, before the cancer took her voice, then her breath, then her presence from the lighthouse that had been their home for the last decade of her too short life. He sat in the lamp room, surrounded by the massive lens that had guided ships to safety for over a century, and tried to rationalize what he had heard. Old buildings make sounds, metal expands and contracts, wind plays tricks with acoustics, but even as he told himself these reasonable things, Samuel knew he had heard Morse code, clear, deliberate, intentional, and someone or something was trying to reach him. The next night the message came earlier, at 2:43 a.m., when the moon was full and the sea was calm as black glass. This time, Samuel was ready. He had cleaned the radio room, set up a chair by the window, brought a notebook and a thermos of coffee. The tapping began just as he settled into his vigil, longer this time, more complex. "Lighthouse Keeper, are you alone?" Samuel's hand trembled as he wrote down the dots and dashes. His handwriting, usually steady as lighthouse beam, wavered across the page like a ship fighting rough seas. He waited, counted to 60, then picked up a pencil and tapped his response against the window frame. "Yes, who are you?" The silence that followed stretched like the space between lightning and thunder. Then, "Keeper, before you need to finish what I started." Samuel stared at his notebook. In 11 years at Beacon Point, he had never asked about his predecessor. The Coast Guard had simply transferred him here after Margaret's diagnosis, to a lighthouse they said needed a steady hand, a quiet place for a man carrying grief like stones in his pockets. He had assumed the previous keeper had simply retired, moved to Florida, bought a condo, played golf, the ordinary end to an ordinary career. But as he sat in the radio room, surrounded by equipment that hadn't worked in a decade, receiving messages from someone who claimed to be his predecessor, Samuel began to understand that nothing about Beacon Point Light was ordinary. The third night, the fog rolled in like a living thing. It didn't drift. It moved with purpose, wrapping around the lighthouse in spirals, as if the tower were drawing it close, like a blanket around tired shoulders. The message came at 2:30 a.m., longer than before, more urgent. My name was Richard Cole Keeper, year 1962 to 1973, disappeared during storm, October 15th. Samuel stopped writing. October 15th was tomorrow, 50 years ago tomorrow. Never found my body, never finished my duty ship, still out there, still needs warning. The pencil slipped from Samuel's fingers. Outside, the fog pressed closer against the windows, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of a foghorn. But Beacon Point Light hadn't had a foghorn in 20 years. They think I abandoned my post. Truth is different. Stayed too long. Tried to save them. Samuel picked up his pencil with hands that shook like his father's in the last months before the stroke. Save who? The response came immediately, as if Richard Cole had been waiting 50 years to tell this story to someone who would listen. Merchant, Vessel Mary, Celeste, two lost radio contact, last seen heading for Devil's Teeth Rocks. Samuel knew the Devil's Teeth, a cluster of jagged rocks 2 miles northeast of the lighthouse. Ships had been wrecking there for over a century. In heavy fog, they were invisible until too late. Tried to signal them with lighthouse beam, but storm damaged the rotation mechanism. Samuel looked up at the massive lens that surrounded him. Even now, in calm weather, he could see the stress fractures in some of the prisms, hairline cracks that caught the light and scattered it into rainbow fragments. Damage that had never been fully repaired. Climbed outside to fix the lens during the storm, lost my footing. The image formed in Samuel's mind with terrible clarity. A man clinging to the outside of the lighthouse, hurricane winds, trying to repair the very light that could save lives while the storm tried to tear him from the tower like a leaf from a tree. Fell into the sea, never surfaced, but never left. Ship crashed on Devil's Teeth. 17 souls lost, my fault. Samuel set down his pencil. Outside, the fog had thickened until the lighthouse seemed suspended in a gray void, cut off from the world by walls of mist that moved and breathed like something alive. He walked to the window and pressed his palm against the glass. The fog swirled in response to his touch, as if it recognized the warmth of living flesh. Are you still here? He tapped against the frame. Never left, never could leave. Duty unfinished. 50 years tonight. Anniversary, they come back. Who comes back? The Mary Celeste II and her crew every October. 15th, they sail past. Lost souls looking for the light that should have saved them. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, understanding. He had been alone in the lighthouse for 11 years, tending a light that guided modern ships with GPS and radar and collision avoidance systems. Ships that barely needed the old lighthouse except as a backup, a redundant safety measure in an age of technology. But some ships weren't sailing in the modern world. Some ships were still lost in the storm that sank them 50 years ago. What do you need me to do? Help me finish what I started, repair the lens, restore the signal, guide them home, not to harbor, to rest. Samuel spent the day studying the lighthouse with new eyes. The lens apparatus was a marvel of 19th century engineering. Hundreds of prisms arranged in concentric circles around a single bright light. When it rotated properly, it created a beam visible for 20 miles in clear weather. But the rotation mechanism was indeed damaged. Gears worn down, bearings seized, motor connections corroded by decades of salt air. The official reports listed it as scheduled for repair when budget allows, but the budget never allowed, and 17 souls remained lost in a storm that ended 50 years ago. Samuel began the work of restoration, not because he believed in ghosts, but because he believed in duty and the responsibility that came with tending a light in the darkness. In the ancient contract between those on shore and those at sea, he worked methodically, the way Margaret had taught him to approach impossible tasks, one small step at a time, without looking ahead to see how far the journey stretched, cleaning each prism individually, testing each connection, lubricating every gear with oil that smelled like machine shops and honest work. The lighthouse seemed to approve. As he worked, Samuel began to hear other sounds, footsteps on the stairs when he was alone in the lamp room, the creak of the door opening and closing in rooms he hadn't visited. Voices carried on the wind, not words, but the rhythm of conversation, of people working together toward a common purpose. Richard Cole's messages continued each night, but they were different now, less urgent, more collaborative. Good work on Prism 7 clean the contacts, on the motor housing storm coming tomorrow, just like 50 years ago, will be ready, and Samuel found that he was ready. Not just the lighthouse himself. For 11 years he had been the keeper of a light that felt like an artifact, a museum piece maintained more for tradition than necessity. But now he understood. Some purposes transcend time. Some duties echo across decades, waiting for the right person to complete them. Some lights shine not just for the ships that are sailing now, but for the ships that are still lost in storms that never ended. October 15th arrived with a sky the color of old pewter and wind that tasted of rain and salt, and something deeper, the metallic tang of electricity building in clouds that moved like living mountains across the sea. Samuel spent the afternoon making final adjustments to the lens apparatus. The rotation mechanism turned smoothly now, the massive light sweeping its beam across water that grew darker and more restless with each passing hour. As evening approached, the fog began to form, not the soft drifting mist of ordinary weather, but something denser, more purposeful. It rose from the sea in columns, like smoke from invisible fires, then spread across the water in patterns that seemed almost geometric, as if the fog itself were following a map drawn by unseen hands. By sunset, Beacon Point Light was an island in an ocean of gray silence. The radio room began tapping at exactly 8:17 p.m. Storm approaching, same track as 50 years ago. Can you see them yet? Samuel climbed to the lamp room and peered out into the fog. At first, nothing. Then, gradually, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Not solid shapes, suggestions, impressions. The ghost of a hull, the shadow of a mast, the outline of a ship that existed in the space between memory and sight. The Mary Celeste, too. She sailed slowly through the fog, her phantom crew working phantom rigging, following the same course that had led them to destruction half a century ago. Samuel activated the lighthouse beam. The light cut through the supernatural fog like a sword through silk, bright and steady and impossible to ignore. He began the sequence Richard Cole had taught him. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 3 long. The international distress signal, SOS, but reversed. Not a call for help, an offer of it. The ghost ship changed course. Slowly, like a dream remembering how to become real, the Mary Celeste, too, turned toward the lighthouse beam. Samuel could see them now. The crew. 17 figures moving across the deck with the fluid purpose of sailors who knew their ship and their duty, but their faces were pale as foam, and their movements had the weightless quality of things seen underwater. They had been sailing toward the Devil's Teeth for 50 years, following the same route that had killed them, unable to change course because the light that should have warned them had failed at the crucial moment. But tonight, the light was working. Samuel kept the beam steady on the ghost ship as she approached the treacherous rocks. The Mary Celeste, too, sailed past the Devil's Teeth with room to spare, guided by the lighthouse. that had failed her 50 years too late. As the ship passed the lighthouse, Samuel could see the faces of the crew turning towards the tower. They were smiling, not with joy, with relief. The relief of men who had finally completed a journey that had taken half a century to finish. The Mary Celeste, too, sailed into the fog beyond the rocks and disappeared, not into destruction, into peace. The radio room fell silent. Samuel waited until dawn, but no more messages came. In the morning, the fog lifted like a curtain being drawn back to reveal an ordinary sea under an ordinary sky. But the lighthouse beam continued to rotate, steady and strong, casting its warning across waters that held no ghost ships, only the living sea and the living ships that sailed upon it, and the eternal dance between light and darkness that plays out every night on every shore where someone keeps vigil against the storm. Samuel found a single message waiting in the radio room, tapped out in Morse code on the dusty surface of the old desk. Thank you, duty, complete rest well, and below it, in handwriting that was not his own, for Samuel Thorne, who finished what I started. The light endures. Arcole. Samuel kept the lighthouse for 7 more years. He never received another supernatural message, but he never stopped listening for them. Every night, he climbed to the lamp room and watched the beam sweep across the water, knowing that somewhere in the space between light and darkness, between past and present, other souls might be sailing toward home through storms that existed only in memory. The lighthouse remained a refuge for the living and a beacon for the lost. Ships passed safely in the night, guided by a light that had learned the difference between duty and completion, between service and sacrifice, and sometimes, on foggy nights in October, when the wind carried the scent of salt and story across the water, Samuel would hear the faint sound of Morse code drifting on the air. Not a message asking for help, but a message of thanks, tapped out by invisible hands on the keys of phantom radios, reminding him that some services echo across time and some lights never truly go out. When Samuel retired, he left behind a logbook filled with ordinary entries about weather and maintenance and the daily routine of keeping a lighthouse running. But on the last page, in careful handwriting, he wrote, October 15th marks the anniversary of the Mary Celeste II, lost with all hands in 1973. The previous keeper, Richard Cole, died attempting to save them. If you hear Morse code in the radio room, listen carefully. Some duties pass from keeper to keeper, and some lights serve ships that are no longer sailing in our time. The beam you tend may guide the living, but it also serves the lost. Keep both purposes in your heart, and the light will never fail. The new keeper read this entry and smiled, thinking it was the charming folklore of an old man who had spent too many nights alone with the sea, until October 15th of his first year, when the fog rolled in like a living thing, and the radio room began to tap out a message in Morse code. Can you hear me? And he realized that some stories are not folklore. Some stories are instructions. Some lights burn, not just for those who are sailing toward shore, but for those who have been sailing in circles for decades, waiting for someone to show them the way home. The lighthouse beam continues to rotate, night after night, season after season, casting its warning and its welcome across waters that hold both the living and the lost. and in the radio room, where dust gathers on equipment that hasn't worked in decades, the walls themselves remember how to speak in the language of dots and dashes, carrying messages between worlds, between times, between the darkness and the light that calls every soul home. The sea remembers everything. The lighthouse remembers more. And somewhere in the space between memory and hope, ships continue to sail through storms that ended long ago, guided by lights, tended by keepers who understand that duty transcends time and service never truly ends. It only passes from hand to hand, from heart to heart, from one keeper to the next, an unbroken chain of light stretching back to the first fire lit on the seventh first shore by the first person who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand watch in the darkness and keep the beacon burning.